Hey everyone, Father Lane here. Welcome to another class in our course on the Pauline letters. Today we have come to Globe Life Park in Arlington, Texas. Actually, this is the older Globe Life Park in Arlington, Texas. The new one has opened, but because of COVID, I haven't had a chance to visit it yet. So we're across the parking lot at the old ballpark, the home of the Texas Rangers. It's appropriate that we're here at the home of the Texas Rangers to discuss 1 Timothy because just as the real Texas Rangers maintain order in the state of Texas, so also is 1 Timothy focused on order in the early church. Let's go ahead and take a look at our agenda for today. We'll first look at some diachronic questions, continuing what we discussed in our last class. That key question, did St. Paul, at least the historical St. Paul, write this letter? And if so, where was he? What was going on when it was written? Then we're going to look, as we always do, at a synchronic survey of the letter. And then finally, we'll deal with some theological questions, including a very thorny one concerning the role of women in the early church. But let's begin with the diachronic questions. We spoke already in our last class that it's very much disputed among scholars as to whether Paul wrote any of the 3 pastoral letters. We talked about how 2 Timothy is different from 1 Timothy and Titus, but 1 Timothy presents some unique challenges. Let's look at a couple of examples. We begin with the first verses after the prescript. This is chapter 1, verses 3 and 4. I repeat the request I made of you when I was on my way to Macedonia, that you stay in Ephesus to instruct certain people, not to teach false doctrines or to concern themselves with myths and endless genealogies, which promote speculations rather than the plan of God that is to be received by faith. 2 details in this passage strike me as interesting. First is this mention of Macedonia and Ephesus. We know, because Acts of the Apostles told us, and we can infer it from 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians and Romans, that Paul had spent a long time in Ephesus and then had gone to Macedonia, where he wrote 2 Corinthians, before proceeding south to Corinth, where he wrote Romans. If authentic, Paul could have written this letter towards the end of his 3rd missionary journey. It's also possible he could have written it upon returning to the Holy Land or during a subsequent imprisonment, although unlike the 5 captivity letters, there's no evidence in this letter that Paul is writing from prison. What's interesting, though, is that Timothy is in Ephesus. He's told to stay in Ephesus, so it would seem that he is still in Ephesus. But if so, it's awfully interesting that Ephesians makes no mention of anything like this. Now, of course, that's debatable because was Ephesians written to Ephesus? We already saw that was debatable. So the consensus starts to break down. Making this even more complicated is the second detail to notice in this passage, and that is this mention of false doctrines, myths, and endless genealogies. A number of scholars suggest that the challenges that are being spoken of here resonate more with Gnosticism as it began to emerge at the end of the 1st century or the early 2nd century. It doesn't seem to fit the 50s and 60s well. So that's really one strike against authenticity here. Let's look at another important passage. This comes from the end of the letter. We're in chapter 6, verse 20. It concludes, O Timothy, guard what has been entrusted to you. Avoid profane babbling and the absurdities of so-called knowledge. The Greek word for knowledge in this verse is gnosis. We have the genitive gnoseos, because you can see there's an of shortly before it. But it's referring to this knowledge. Does the letter intend gnosis in the sense of Gnosticism? By itself, this passage can't answer that question, and indeed, proponents of authenticity have an answer to that. Moreover, we have a clear 3-fold division between bishops, presbyters, and deacons. All 3 are described in detail in this letter. This clear delineation and the fleshed out structure of bishops, presbyters, and deacons seems to ill fit the 50s or 60s. So this leads a majority of scholars to believe that 1 Timothy was written sometime after Paul's death, although the scholarship is divided on the issue. Let's look at our epistolary elements. Again, the name sender is Paul, but authenticity is disputed. The addressee is Timothy, but again, authenticity is disputed. Interestingly, this letter portrays Timothy as a youth. Paul tells him, don't let people look down on you because you're young. But if this is being written in the 50s or 60s, Timothy had already been sharing in Paul's ministry for well over a decade, which implies he's not quite so young. So some scholars see in that detail an argument for pseudonymity. Again, this argument's not going to end anytime soon, but that's the discussion. What we can infer from the letter is that there are a lot of challenges to church order as well as challenges to false teaching, and Paul writes to redress those problems as well as encourage Timothy to be strong in his ministry. That's certainly a timely message. So let's go ahead and jump to our synchronic survey. You can see on our outline here that after the introduction we have a substantive body, and the most important part of this body is going to focus on practical considerations in the life of the church, especially order in the church, bishops, presbyters, and deacons, as well as the role of women. We're going to look at a passage like that in just a moment, but there's also going to be this motif of preserving what is true and encouraging Timothy to be strong in faith as he fulfills his ministry. So let's jump now to the theology of this letter. And here's a passage that kind of says it all. This is from the beginning of chapter 2. First of all, then, I ask that supplications, prayers, petitions, and thanksgivings be offered for everyone, for kings and for all in authority, that we may lead a quiet and tranquil life in all devotion and dignity. This is good and pleasing to God our Savior, who wills everyone to be saved and to come to the knowledge of the truth. Notice three things in this passage. First, starting at the bottom, who wills everyone to be saved. So we have here an indication of God's universal salvific will. Also, you'll notice that word devotion. This word is a hallmark of the pastoral letters. You can see on your screen here, this word occurs 8 times in 1 Timothy. It occurs also once in 2 Timothy and Titus, but nowhere else at all in the Pauline corpus. And I want to say only 2 or 3 or 4 times elsewhere in the entire New Testament. The other key detail here is notice why Paul is asking for all of these prayers for authority. It's not that all might lead a quiet and tranquil life, but that we may lead a quiet and tranquil life. And so this gives us an indication here that Paul is not going to ruffle feathers within his culture because he is pursuing the greater good of the salvation of souls. This is important when we look at this next passage, which is very controversial. Later in chapter 2. A woman must receive instruction silently and under complete control. I do not permit a woman to teach or to have authority over a man. She must be quiet. For Adam was formed first, then Eve. Further, Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and transgressed. But she will be saved through motherhood, provided women persevere in faith and love and holiness, with self-control. Oh boy, this is not a popular passage today. I would point out that we have a handful of options for interpreting a difficult text like this. Indeed, I'm borrowing from Luke Timothy Johnson's Anchor Bible Commentary. One is to simply deny authenticity, which doesn't actually solve the problem. We believe that 1 Timothy is part of the canon. Whether or not the historical St. Paul wrote the letter or not is irrelevant to its authority in the life of the church. A second option would be to say, well, the text is canonical, but only certain parts of the text are authoritative. Again, I don't think that can be reconciled with a solid theology of inspiration. Moreover, it's arbitrary. We don't want to just say, oh, I don't like this passage, so I don't have to follow it. That's not intellectually satisfying. Our third and best option is to engage the text, so let's do so. Notice the grammar here. Paul says a woman must receive instruction. That verb must is a third person imperative. Let a woman receive instruction silently and under complete control. It's hortatory in thrust. Moreover, notice the next sentence. I do not permit. Here Paul is giving an instruction. The question that's important is, does it apply generally across all times and all cultures, or does it only apply in the specific circumstance in which Paul finds himself? And I would suggest the passage we were just looking at, where Paul is seeking a quiet, tranquil life in the church, indicates it's written for a time and a place. It need not spread to all times and all places. But I would urge us not to run away from this passage, but also not to absolutize it. So here we have an example of a letter that's not always easy to understand, but one that we shouldn't shy away from, but should engage these difficulties with aplomb. In our next class, we'll take a look at Paul's letter to Titus. Until then, read well and pray well.